My neighbor cut down my trees. Just like that, axes swinging, branches crashing, the sound echoing through my yard like a warning. At first I froze, thinking it must be a mistake. Maybe he didn't realize. Maybe it was just carelessness. But the truth hit me before I could even process it. This wasn't a mistake. This was intentional. By the time I stepped into the wreckage, my heart sank. Pieces of my old maple and oak littered the lawn, jagged edges catching the sunlight like cruel reminders of what was lost. These weren't just trees. They were my mornings with coffee in hand, my quiet afternoons reading in the shade, the sanctuary I had built over years of care. And now, someone had erased all of it in a few swings of an axe. I looked at him, my neighbor, standing there like this was nothing, and for a moment I couldn't believe it. How could someone cross a line so blatantly and just smile? The anger rose first, hot and sharp, but underneath it, a deeper feeling began to creep in, a cold, quiet determination. Because this wasn't just wood on the ground. This was my boundaries, my home, my life, and someone had just dared to challenge that. And that's when it hit me. What he thought would be a simple act of destruction was about to turn into a lesson he'd never forget. By the time this was over, the consequences would reach far beyond the fallen branches. If you've ever been crossed or underestimated, I want to hear your story. Comment below. Hit like if you've ever had to fight for what was yours, and subscribe so you don't miss a story where quiet strength becomes unstoppable. But I didn't know it yet. The real battle was just beginning. And it wasn't just my trees he was about to lose. If I hadn't fought back, he would have gotten away with it. At first, I thought maybe he didn't realize what he'd done. Maybe he thought a few trees were no big deal, that no one would notice, that the damage was only skin deep. But deep down, I knew better. Letting this slide wouldn't just mean accepting the loss of branches and leaves. It would mean surrendering my voice, my control, my right to stand up for what was mine. And that I could never allow. These trees weren't just green silhouettes against my yard. They were years of memories etched into every leaf and branch. Countless late afternoons spent watering saplings in the fading sun, mornings raking piles of fallen leaves that smelled like autumn and hard work, weekends shaping their growth while the world went on around me. Every branch carried a story, every root a quiet triumph. And now, lying shattered across the grass like kindling, they screamed a warning I couldn't ignore. Boundaries can be crossed, but only if you let them. The thought of staying silent terrified me more than his axe ever could. Silence meant permission. Silence meant letting someone believe they could take whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, with no consequences. And I knew, if I wanted to reclaim more than just my yard, if I wanted to reclaim my dignity and my peace, I had to act. I had to make him accountable. I didn't know exactly how it would unfold. I didn't know how far the fight would stretch, how the law would see it, or whether the outcome would satisfy the quiet rage and determination that had started burning inside me. All I knew was this: doing nothing wasn't an option. Not this time. Not ever again. Something had shifted, like a storm gathering behind the calm, and when it hit, it would leave no part of this injustice untouched. I grew up in a neighborhood where everyone knew each other's routines, their pets, even the sound of their lawnmowers echoing on a quiet Sunday morning. Streets were lined with fences so neat you could almost see the pride in each picket, flower beds bursting with colors that whispered of care and quiet competition. My yard, tucked between the familiar houses, had always been my sanctuary. Rows of maples, oaks, and a cherry tree I planted the summer I turned 12. They weren't just trees. They were my mornings with coffee steaming in my hands, my evenings lost in books beneath their shade, the quiet little world where I felt like I belonged, if only for a few hours a day. Then there was Tom, my neighbor just a few houses down. Polite on the surface, a nod here, a wave there, but beneath that civility was a simmering resentment that had been quietly building for years, barely noticeable until the moment it erupted. At first, it was minor. A branch he claimed leaned too far over his fence, a comment about my grass being too tall, complaints about the shade my trees cast over his garden. I smiled, nodded, tried to keep things calm. After all, this is the dance of neighborhood life. Smile, pretend it's nothing, hope it passes. But tensions, even the smallest ones, accumulate like dark clouds on the horizon. You don't notice the storm brewing until the first lightning strikes. And for me, that strike came one deceptively quiet Saturday morning. I stepped outside to a scene I couldn't have imagined. The green sanctuary I had nurtured for years reduced to jagged stumps and splintered wood, sawdust scattered across the lawn like snow in spring. And Tom, he stood there, arms crossed, a faint grin on his face, as if every swing of his axe carried no consequence beyond his own satisfaction. It wasn't just vandalism. It wasn't even just property damage. It was a message, sharp and deliberate. I can take what I want, and no one can stop me. That moment, frozen in sunlight and sawdust, was when I realized something crucial. This wasn't a dispute to be settled with a polite conversation over the fence. This was the beginning of a battle I didn't yet understand, but one I would not let go. The weight of what had happened pressed down on me, but so did a flicker of something else, determination. He thought this was just about trees. He had no idea how much more was at stake. And by the time the dust settled, the consequences for underestimating me would be far greater than he ever imagined. That morning, I remember the sound before anything else, the sharp crack of wood splitting, the sickening snap of branches, the way the leaves tumbled through the air as if they were surrendering to some unseen force. My chest tightened, my stomach dropped, and I ran outside, expecting a minor accident, maybe a branch caught in the wrong place. But what I saw stopped me cold. Tom was there, standing in my yard, hands grimy with sap and soil, a grin tugging at his face that didn't quite reach his eyes. My trees, decades of care, quiet mornings with coffee in hand, afternoons lost in books beneath their shade, weekends shaping their growth, were gone. In their place was chaos. Jagged stumps, splintered branches, leaves scattered like forgotten memories. For a long moment, I couldn't move. Anger bubbled up first, hot and immediate, but underneath it was something heavier. Violation. Not the kind that comes from a broken fence or a lost plant, but the kind that gnaws at your sense of self. My yard wasn't just dirt and trees. It was my sanctuary, my boundaries, my small, private world. And in a few careless swings of an axe, he had shattered all of it. I called his name, my voice quivering with disbelief and fury. "What are you doing?" I shouted, words trembling, half from anger, half from shock. He shrugged casually, as if he'd done nothing worth noticing. That shrug cut deeper than any insult ever could. It wasn't just what he'd destroyed, it was years of effort, care, and trust. It was the message that my boundaries didn't matter. Neighbors began to appear over fences and windows, murmuring quietly, some shaking their heads in sympathy, some averting their gaze. But even as a few watched, I realized the truth. Nobody was going to step in for me. If I wanted justice, if I wanted anyone to acknowledge what had been taken, it would be up to me alone. I pulled out my phone and camera, documenting every broken branch, every stump, every shadow of what had once been. I called the city office, researching ordinances, property laws, anything that could hold someone accountable. And when Tom tried to brush it off, it was just overhanging. I didn't think it mattered. I felt a shift inside me. He had underestimated me, and that would be his biggest mistake yet. I didn't know exactly what path I would take, didn't know how far it would go, didn't even know if the courts would take me seriously over a tree dispute. But one thing was clear. Doing nothing wasn't an option. This was no longer about trees. It was about respect. About boundaries. About proving, once and for all, that crossing someone's line comes with consequences, even if they thought otherwise. And somewhere in the chaos, a quiet, cold determination began to take root. He thought this was just about trees. He had no idea what was coming next. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and nervous anticipation, a quiet hum of murmurs under the high ceilings that made every small sound echo. I sat there, files stacked meticulously in front of me, my hands steady even as my heart raced like a drum. Tom walked in a few minutes late, head held high, confident, too confident, as if this was still just a minor dispute, a simple annoyance easily shrugged off. He had no idea that the tide had turned, that this was no longer about trees. When the judge called the case, I spoke deliberately, letting each word land carefully, measured. The photos, the notes, the meticulous documentation, all of it told the story my voice couldn't fully capture. Every snapped branch, every jagged stump, every patch of soil torn apart wasn't just evidence of damage. It was proof of disrespect, of someone believing that my space, my effort, my boundaries didn't matter. I didn't yell. I didn't storm or plead. I let the weight of truth, and the quiet fire in my resolve, carry the message for me. Tom tried to play it off, minimize it, claiming accident, triviality, that trees were just wood. But the law doesn't see trees as just wood. It sees property, rights, accountability. Slowly, I watched as his smirk faltered, that confident mask cracking under the realization that he had misjudged not just the law, but me. This wasn't something he could manipulate or dismiss. This was bigger, sharper, and entirely unavoidable. When the verdict finally came, it wasn't just a technical win, it was a reckoning. It was the affirmation that boundaries matter, that effort matters, that respect matters. Tom would face consequences for what he thought he could get away with. I left the courtroom with a strange calm, a quiet triumph that pulsed beneath the surface. This wasn't about revenge, it was about proving that measured, deliberate action carries its own power. Standing up for yourself doesn't have to be loud, it just has to be unwavering. Back in my yard, I planted new saplings in the empty spaces, each one a small promise and a quiet rebellion against destruction. Every dig into the earth, every seed dropped, every careful pat of soil was a reminder. Damage can be repaired, boundaries can be restored, and underestimated strength can grow where others see only weakness. By the time the first leaves unfurled, I realized the fight hadn't just been about trees. It had been about showing up for yourself when no one else will, about turning violation into validation, about discovering that sometimes quiet persistence carries a power louder than any axe or empty apology. And in those new branches reaching skyward, I could almost hear it, the whisper of boundaries respected, of effort acknowledged, and of a lesson learned by someone who thought he had the upper hand. A lesson he would never forget. Sometimes, people think that ignoring a problem, walking away, or taking the easy path only affects someone else. They believe that silence is harmless, that letting things slide keeps life simple. But standing your ground, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it shakes your sense of safety, reveals truths that go far deeper than the surface. It shows you who people really are. It shows you what you're capable of. And it shows you exactly what you're willing to fight for, and what you refuse to surrender, no matter the cost. My trees were never just wood and leaves. They were living proof of care, patience, and the countless small choices I made to nurture something meaningful. When Tom cut them down, he thought it was just an act of vandalism, a minor inconvenience. But by standing up, by refusing to stay silent, I didn't just reclaim what was taken from me. I discovered a strength I never knew existed, a voice that refuses to be ignored, a resolve that grows stronger with every challenge. Have you ever had to defend something that meant more than just material value? Something that represented your dignity, your boundaries, or your very sense of self? Something that, if taken, would have left a part of you invisible? That's the fight that really matters, the one that makes you realize your own power. Don't let anyone convince you that silence, inaction, or compromise is easier. Protect what matters. Stand tall, even when it feels like the odds are stacked against you. And if this story stirred something in you, don't just keep it to yourself. Share it below. Tell me about what you've fought for, what you've refused to give up, or the lessons you've learned while standing your ground. Because sometimes, the quietest battles carry the loudest lessons. Sometimes, planting your own roots, building your own space, or defending what's yours is the most powerful statement you can make. And the truth is, when you do, the world notices, even if it's years later. If this story hit you the way it hit me, the way it made you feel the anger, the frustration, and then the quiet power of standing your ground, then don't just watch. Smash that like button and let the world know you care about fighting for what's yours. I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me your story. Have you ever had to defend something that mattered more than anyone else realized? Maybe it was a person, a dream, a space, or even just your voice. Share it because your experience matters, and sometimes the lessons we learn quietly are the ones that echo the loudest. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story that dives into courage, resilience, and the strength that comes from building your own space when no one else shows up. These aren't just tales, they're reminders that standing up for yourself can change everything, even when it feels impossible. Remember, this isn't just a story about trees, or disputes, or victories on paper. It's about knowing your worth, protecting your boundaries, and making sure your voice is never ignored. Every battle you choose to fight, every line you refuse to let be crossed, is proof that your presence matters, and your victories deserve to be seen. And who knows? Maybe your next story, the one you share in the comments, will inspire someone else to finally stand up for what they thought was lost, or overlooked, or taken. Sometimes the quietest battles have the power to change lives.